on stream right now, like on Discord.
I can see it all right. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Okay, hi. Yeah, so I'm a very experienced or fairly experienced Wormhole space player, right? And I'll be talking about evictions today. Um, so preface, right? Like I've participated in many evictions, I've seen in many evictions, and I think large-scale evictions are probably my like favorite content in Eve, right? Like the most memorable memories I have of Eve are doing evictions, and going off of my last Q&A about Wormhole space in general, I thought this was like an interesting subject to do a more in-depth class on. So that's what we'll be doing today. So yeah, short overview, right? Like we'll be going through evictions. We'll mostly be going through like actually performing an eviction, so being on the attacker side. But I will give some tips on how to defend and how to prepare your home in case you get evicted, right? And I think that through understanding how evictions work, like from the offensive side, you'll also get a better idea of like what is a good way to defend against them, if that makes sense, right? So I guess for the newer players or those less experienced in Wormhole space, we'll preface like of what is an eviction, right? So an eviction very simply is like you kill all the structures that somebody owns in a wormhole, right? A wormhole space, corps or groups will usually live in one wormhole, right? They'll have like a main home wormhole where all their players live and all their assets are. And you go in and you kill all those structures, right? For whatever reason. That's an eviction, right? What makes them interesting is one of the factors that makes it interesting is that when a structure in wormhole space dies, all the assets contained within that structure, right? So the stuff in the hangars of the players, the ship that the players have in their hangar, etc., 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 they all drop as loot. So what you can see here in the picture is the Hard Knocks Keepster that died years ago. And all those yellow little cans are like somebody's assets that dropped from the structure, right? So they can be extremely lucrative, and there's a big reason to fight for these evictions, right? Like to defend against them and to attack somebody's home or somebody's base. So that's one of the main like parts of an eviction, right? The timers are fairly short as well, right? There's a 24 timer between the shield and armor. There's a 48-hour timer between armor and hull. So it's like a 3-day effect. It's fairly quick, usually on a weekend, right? So it's like a nice weekend activity to do once in a while. There's also no death clones in Wormhole space, right? So if you bought a player out during a fight, they'll respawn in whatever their home station is in normal space, high sec, low sec, null sec, whatever, right? And so a large part of evictions goes around not just the timers themselves and the fight themselves, but also all the time around it, where the attackers, who usually will outnumber the defenders, will be camping the wormhole basically, right, to ensure that the defenders don't get their allies in. So it's the activity during an eviction is not just during the timer; it's a round the clock event, right, from the start to the finish. You need people online, ready to play, ready to be active, 24/7, basically. So why would you do an eviction, right? Because it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of commitment. I mean, first and foremost, this large objective, right? There's a large reason to defend for the defenders. Often leads to very fun and big fights. You can see here is a report for an eviction, the final timer of the TD Sin eviction, which happened in 2020. It's one of the biggest fights that have ever happened in Wormhole space with thousands of players there, right? It's a lot of fun. And like getting fights like that to happen is fairly unique in Wormhole space. The stakes are super high, right? Like if you win, you get all their assets. If you lose months of preparation. So these are extremely intense fights. It can be a ton of fun. And that's for me the reason why I like doing evictions, right? And the second reason, obviously, is there's a lot of loot to be gained. If you successfully evict someone, you can make hundreds of billions if you pick the right target, right? Or simply you want the wormhole, right? You want to live in that wormhole, so you want the new home, so you evict whoever lives there and you start to live there. Or you want your own farm hole, right? So you evict somebody else's wormhole. Or simply, you don't like the guy, fuck that guy. So, you kill their structures, and that's also a very valid reason. So, as I said, I'll be going through the whole process of an eviction, right? Like from the target selection to planning to the actual execution of the eviction. So the first step is selecting a target, right? This is very important. First, you need to think like, what is your goal, right? So, for example, let's say you're not there for the fight, you just want to make some good money. Then you want to choose somebody that's been living in a certain wormhole for quite a long time, right? The structures have been up for a long time, so like a lot of assets have accumulated over time that are going to drop once you kill the structure. You're going to look for somebody that's maybe not very good at PvP or maybe a smaller group than you, right? maybe somebody without a lot of friends that are going to be like an easy target for you. And, you can scout their home. You can find out how active they are and how long they've been living in a wormhole by looking at Zico, the activity of the wormhole and of the corporation, right? If you want a fight, you might choose maybe a PvP group, right? You might choose a group that's more likely to fight when they get attacked. You might choose a group that's a bit bigger, maybe the same size as you, right? So the fight is more even, giving them more reasons to undock. Or maybe you want to claim the new wormhole, in which case you'll be looking at the wormhole itself, right? What is the effect? What is the class? What are the statics? What am I looking for? Let's say I want a farm hole. That will be a C5 or a C6. Maybe a nice effect like a pulsar or a magnetar, right? And it may be owned by somebody that's a lot weaker than me, so it's going to be an easy eviction. Now, when it comes to, you found your target, but you need to find the wormhole. I mean, there's two main ways. This part can be a bit of a pain. So often, like what I'll do, for example, if I'm looking for like a random target for an eviction, I'll start randomly like rolling for a wormhole, and then each wormhole I check who lives there. Are these a valid target, right? But say you specifically want to evict one specific group, you can see, okay, they live in a class 5, so I'm just going to rage roll class 5 wormholes all day until I get them to their home. Or what you can also do is you can camp Cheetah, right? You can just sit on the Cheetah, undock, sit them red, and wait for one of their players to undock because he's doing a hauling trip or he died or whatever, right? And then you just follow him through high sec, see where he enters a wormhole and scan the chain, right? Scan up chain until you find their home. Another very important part of target selection is the structures. Structures have timers in wormhole space, right? Like there's a specific time of day that the timer will come out of in armor and hull. This is plus or minus 2 hours from the timer that they have set, if that makes sense, right? So obviously, like if you are a group and you guys are all Europeans and you're going to attack someone and their timers are like 4 a.m. your time, you're going to have a bad time, right? We'll go over how to figure out how to find somebody's timers in like in another slide. That's a fairly important thing. And also the static and the class are quite important. For example, a wormhole with a static to known space can be a lot harder to evict. So like let's say a C2 nullsec is harder to evict because it's harder to control that nullsec static. A C2 nullsec also has a second static, so it's twice the wormholes you need to control, which is a bit of a pain. And things like that you take into consideration, right? And also the effects. Some effects are harder to fight into. For example, pulsars are notoriously some of the more difficult wormholes to evict because pulsars, they give you a bonus to shield, but they also make your signature a lot bigger. And that means that very often the defenders will have capital advantage, right? They've been living in the wormhole for a long time. They'll have a lot of capitals than you won't. And those capitals are going to have a much easier time hitting your ships. So pulsar, for that reason, can be quite hard to evict. So, okay, you've chosen your target, right? You found, let's say, a nice C5 without an effect, and there's a group that lives there, and it's got a C5 static, and you want to evict that wormhole. Now you go on to scouting, right? You've done your research, you've seen their Zico, you know kind of when they're active, etc. But you need to figure out, how active are they actually in the wormhole, right? You've got your seed, so your scout, we got a seed in wormhole space at least, right? You got your scout in with a scanning ship, and you need to get some intel, right? So the main things you'll be looking at is the activity, right? Simple way to do that is you park your scanner like on the on dock, right, off their main citadel, cloaked, of course, right? And you can even, for example, record your screen overnight, leave your computer running, right, and go through the footage in the morning, speed it up. So look, like at what time do they have? How many people docked? Are there any like dead times in their activity, right? Let's say around 6 a.m. Eve time. From then on, there's nobody logged in ever. Okay, if I need to get more things into that wormhole before I do the eviction and I don't want to be seen, then that is going to be a good time for me to get into the wormhole, right? Or get my friends in or whatever. Um, you also want to keep note of how many capitals and what kind you see, both like when they go around doing their things in the wormhole and on Z-Kill, because like I mentioned, right, often the defenders will have the capital advantage. That's one of the main advantages that the defenders have, right? So you want to be very aware, like what are you fighting? What kind of capitals are you going to be fighting? And the third thing is, it should be on the next slide, is their structures, right? You want to know what their structures are fit like and when the timers are. Those two are very important. So how do you find out the structure fit? Structure fit is quite simple, actually. You just need to use a ship scanner on the structure, and a window like the one that you can see on screen right now will pop up and show you the structure fit. When it comes to the timer, it's a bit more complicated. You need to hack their structure the same way you would hack an exploration site, right? Both data and relic scanners work. There's no difference. So just pick whichever one your scanner has the highest skill for to make it easier. You'll get the hacking minigame, and then you'll get the pop-up once you successfully complete the minigame with the timer of the structure. Important to know is that you will be decloaked and very close to the structure when you do this. So do this when they're not online, otherwise they'll just see you and kill you, right? Which is a bad thing. Now, the structure fit is quite important. This is the fit of a keepstar that we recently evicted, right? So this picture was taken before we did the eviction when we were figuring out what it was fit like. So structure fits are quite versatile. They can be fit in a multitude of different ways. They can have both anti-capital missile launchers, which have do a lot of damage to capital ships, but not so much to sub-capital ships, right? To your cruisers or battle cruisers or even battleships. So if they have those on their structure, you won't want to like drop your dreadnought on the structure because it's just going to die, right? But your subcaps will be safe while bashing. Otherwise, there's multi-role missile launchers. Those do quite a bit of damage to your sub-capital ships. So then, you need more logistics, right, to bash the structure successfully. Another thing to keep in mind is what kind of EWAR it has. Structures can have ECM, which is quite powerful, right? And if they have like 2 or 3 ECM modules, they'll basically permajam 2 or 3 of your logi ships. So you need more logi ships than what you would need just to tank the DPS, right? If that makes sense. Another very important thing is the PDS. Structures in EVE can have a point defense battery, which is basically a smart bomb, right? For all intents and purposes. Which can, like it goes around the whole structure. So if your fleet is like on top of the structure, everybody's taking damage, your drones will die. It's all quite bad, right? So the main thing with PDS is the range can vary hugely at 5 or 7 kilometers at the low end to like 20 at the high end. Don't quote me on that. It's been a while. But basically, you want to check on PyFi, like the actual structure, and where it has a T1 or T2 point defense and what kind of rigs it has, and that'll tell you the range. It's something important to keep a note of, right? And then during the fight, you'll know, okay, I don't want to have my fleet within that range of the structure unless we all want to take damage. Okay, now we'll go on to planning now, right? So you found your target, you found their structure fits, their activity, etc., right? How do you go about actually planning your eviction from this point on? The first thing you're going to need is what we call an eviction package, right? It's just a name for all the like baseline assets you'll need for an eviction. Many PvP corporations will have several of these ready to go in Jira or in their home so they can go at a moment's notice if an opportunity arises, right? But these are just basics. Like it's very important that you have a staging pulse, um, which which will anchor very quickly so you can live out of that boss while you wait for your actual big structure, your Astra House or Athon or whatever you decide to use, right? To anchor. You want to make sure you have fuel. You want to make sure you have strontium for the boss so it doesn't die instantly if they attack it. You want to make sure you have your fits. And just remembering is a small thing I forgot to say earlier. One important thing when you scout a target is also check all of their moons and make sure there is a moon without a boss, right? Or if there is a boss, make sure it's not online because you need like each moon can only have one boss on it. And a boss is almost mandatory. It's very hard to do an eviction if you cannot anchor your own boss, right? So one of the first things you're going to need to do when you get into the wormhole is killing one of those bosses so you can anchor your own boss. But if their boss is online and stronted, it'll have a reinforcement timer, so then you won't be able to kill it right on time, which can be very annoying. Another quite important thing you need for an eviction, of course, are rolling ships, right? Like rolling battleships or capitals, depending on what class of wormhole you're evicting, and rolling hicks, right? To roll those crit holes. And always bring spares. You always need more than you think because people will log off with them, or they'll die, or they'll get lost in some way. It always happens. And if you end up in a situation where you don't have any of this left, then you're going to have a very, very hard time. And other small things like anchorable bubbles can be very useful in some situations. Spare interdictors, right, like sabers and stuff, because those always die and they're good to have. They're very useful on grid. And an ample supply of bashing ammo, right? So whatever doctrine you choose, some like faction or T1 ammo, like with whatever damage type, doesn't matter, just like a lot of that. So you don't run out while bashing the structure. It's like once you have like 100 guys in grid shooting a structure for 20 minutes, that, ammo gets burnt up real fast. Also, since evictions are a 3-day event, right, around the clock, it's important that you set a date ahead of time and tell your guys, your friends, like, hey, you know, 2 months from now on this weekend, we're going to do an eviction or we're going to do a big up. This allows people to maybe take time off or maybe, not plan any other things that weekend if they want to be around. It'll ensure that you'll have enough people. But it's also very important that you're not too liberal with the information you give out, right? If you tell people exactly who you're going to be attacking, the more people you tell, the higher the chance that somehow something gets leaked. And if it gets leaked, the enemy is going to know and they'll prepare and you're going to have a very, very hard time, right? So OPSEC is also very important. Keep the important intel to people you trust and people that are actually helping with the planning of the eviction. Now, as far as Doctrine goes, right? So, of course, once you do an eviction, you're going to need to choose a fleet comp for the eviction, right? And there's really no one size fits all solution at all, right? What I'm showing here, this spy picture, is what we used for the eviction of the whole control keeps there a couple of months ago. These are cruise missile Ravens, which generally speaking would not be that good, right? But since this is a black hole wormhole, which has very nice bonuses to missile range, suddenly these Ravens actually become quite strong, right? So you're going to need to plan around the target that you're hitting, and you're going to need to plan around the effect of the wormhole. I don't really have like a one size fits all solution because every time I plan an eviction, I theory craft a new comp from scratch, but often at least, right? For bigger targets, that is. When it comes to smaller targets, I mean, if you're a wormhole corp, you'll have like some kind of brawling doctrine that usually works quite well. If it's just like 20, 30 of your guys versus, 10, 20 of theirs and some capital ships. That combo will actually probably do the best job because limited numbers, it'll have the DPS to burn through capitals. It'll also have the DPS to reinforce the structures at a decent time. But for larger evictions, you really want those long range blob comps, right? Like think nullsec type compositions. Um, I mean, nullsecers, they do this stuff every day. So I take a lot of inspiration from nullsec FCs and the type of comps that they use, right? Because this is kind of their territory in a way. Um, So I look around Zico, I talk to some FCs, I see what is the current flavor of the month meta in nullsec and why, and I build my comp around that often. One nice thing to note, T1 battleships are quite strong for their price, right, in large numbers. They're fairly tanky, they do a lot of nice damage. They're not too expensive, so those are often like very nice options, like you can see here, which is a Raven, right, as our main line. Fairly cheap shit, does a lot of damage, a lot of range, very cool. If you really want like ISK is not an issue and you run like the best ship possible, like DFIs and nightmares are very cool and things like that, right? Faction battleships are gonna be like your go-to, maybe marauders even in some situations. But basically you want a very tanky, solid ship that hits hard and at a long range because you gotta imagine like in the citadel grids, right? The grid is very large, the citadel is very large, and the enemy, like if you are just in a brawling slow comp, they can kite you forever while being in the safety of structured tether, right? So they can just go around and slowly kill you, and if you do manage to somehow get on top of them, it's very easy for them to tether up again. So you need something that can contest their long range comp that they will probably have for home defense. Okay, so you have your comp plan, right? Now there's a small preface that after this, I'm gonna go through basically step by step, right, from day one to day three, how you're gonna go about doing this eviction in a way. But the most important preface is hull control. So what is hull control? Hull control is what we call when we control a wormhole. When so each wormhole has a static, right? For example, our example, a C5 with a C5 static, right? What you will want to do, like we discussed earlier, right? Like you want to keep uh, your enemies isolated, right? You do not want to allow them to get all their friends into the wormhole and get like the numbers to actually, win a fight against you, right? So how do you do that? Well, what we tend to do in these situations, right? We We'll put mass on the wormhole, on the static, for example, right? In the case of a C5, you just need a carrier to roll it, right? Or any capital already. So you jump out with the carrier, you jump back in with the carrier, and the hole's gone. So all we do, we just jump out and then we cloak the carrier on the outside, right? What happens then if for some reason, right, they have allies that manage to get close to coming in, you spot a fleet in the static that is about to get in, whatever, right? Whatever happens, all the carrier has to do is decloak, jump back, hole's gone, right? And the wormhole is completely isolated again. Of course, you'll close all incoming connections, right? Um, and while you're doing that, right, you will scan out the chain, right? You'll find whatever entrances to like high sec, low sec, whatever there are. So you can get your allies in, your friends in, your corp mates in, supplies in, whatever, while denying them any kind of access to the wormhole, right? This is key. And usually during most, like, I guess, high-end evictions, right, where like you're fighting an active target, you'll be wanting to keep that whole control 24/7 throughout the whole eviction. So make sure you got some American friends, make sure you have some Australian friends, right, to keep that round-the-clock coverage, right? And a big part of like FCing for an eviction is also managing burnout of people, right? And making sure that it's not just one guy sitting there staring at a wormhole on a screen for 8 hours a day, um, but that this gets like kind of like swapped out as needed, etc., etc. And since whole control is so important, right? A lot of the fights that happen during eviction won't even necessarily be on the structure grid, but often people will try and fight you to regain whole control, right? They'll try and beat your fleet in some time zone, and then they'll take control of the static themselves and get their allies in, right? If that makes sense. So this is kind of like the very important concept when it comes to evictions, and fighting over whole control or having whole control are some very important things to do, basically. So now that I've explained whole control, we're going to go through basically an eviction from start to finish, right? An example for like a hypothetical eviction, right? So the day is come there, right? Like you said, we're going in today. All your allies are ready. All your corp mates are ready. All your supplies are ready. Now you're going to go in. So the first stage is the infill, we call that, right? Is actually getting your people in. This is often the most intensive and critical part of an eviction, right? Especially when it comes to leading and of seeing. It's a lot of stress, a lot of things going on at the same time. It's very important to delegate, right? I always have people, for example, taking care of logistics so that I don't have to like micromanage who's driving what DST, right? Little things like that make it easier on everybody else. So the first wave, right, you will want a combat capable fleet and potentially your basic supplies, mostly rollers, right, are the most important thing. Once you get a combat capable fleet and rollers in, you can establish whole control with those rollers, right? Scan and roll for more case spaces and get more people in and get the ball rolling. Okay. Um, when your comp is a battleship comp, right? Let's say you've chosen like Ravens or whatever, right? Maelstroms, whatever you decided for your eviction, and it's a battleship. Battleships are very heavy. That is going to limit how many ships you can get in on the first wave. So on the largest evictions, right, what people will do, like say, even the whole control eviction we did a couple of months ago, I was expecting to have 200, 250 people in fleet. Um, that's a lot of wormholes to get in. A lot of wormholes that are going to collapse just from 20, 30 Ravens getting in. It's a lot of time spent getting slowly trickling in more combat ships, which is quite bad. So what we did is on day one, we got in with a cruiser or battle cruiser fleet, right? Which is lighter, which means you can get like 100, 200, 300 people in through one wormhole. You don't have to worry about the pilots, right? Um, and then you can use the other wormholes for supplies. And to get the actual Ravens ready for the armor and hull timer, we simply brought in compressed minerals, anchored like reprocessing and industry structures, and we built the Ravens, which once the structures are anchored is actually quite quick. Only took us a couple of hours, right, to pump out like 300 Ravens. It's a lot more space, a lot more mass efficient for the wormhole. It's a lot easier on logistics to get battleships in like that sometimes. Of course, there's a downside that it leaves you vulnerable the first day because you have a weaker comp, right? Your battle cruiser comp is a lot weaker than your battleship comp. So these are things worth considering for the largest evictions. When it comes to smaller evictions, right? Like if it's just you and your 20 best friends or whatever doing it, you're fine just with your battleships because you don't have that concern of like constantly closing wormholes due to the sheer amount of battleships you're bringing in. Then, of course, right, once you have whole control, get your friends in. destroy their pulse or whatever, get your pulse up and running, anchor your structure, and start bashing their structure right away, right? Um, what you'll see in practice is people will, at some point, after you get in, quite quickly realize, like, hey, we're being evicted, right? They'll rage ping their Discord, be like, hello, everybody log in, enemy fleet in our home, and they're about to evict us. If in the majority of times, at least in the majority of evictions that I've been a part of, right, their numbers will spike a lot in their structures, but they'll realize that they don't have quite the numbers that they need to take the fight. And they're also scared, right? Because if they lose half their people on the first day, then they will never have enough people to actually contest whole control later down the line. So often they'll back down and not actually go for a fight. However, be ready, right? Some people do just warp in all their stuff right away. And in many ways, if you are prepared enough, in my opinion, it's quite good to go all in right away the first day because it's when the enemy is going to be the most oversaturated and the most disorganized, right? So they won't be as prepared as they'll be day 2, day 3, when they'll be like fully settled and set up, if that makes sense.
Have you ever seen somebody attempt to contest an eviction on day one like that?
I was thinking about it today. I really don't think I have, at least not on like the larger evictions, right? If that makes sense. On smaller evictions, it happens sometimes, right? But on the larger ones, I don't think I've ever seen like a big noteworthy corp. I mean, okay, I've done it myself once, but it was with a bit of a weird situation. We were doing an eviction of an enemy group, and their friends that tried to counter evict our home, right? This is like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And all we had in our home were our cap alts, like our farming alts. So we basically just had capital ships in our home. And we undocked 20 capital ships, warped them to static, and they decided that, as they were bashing our fortresser, basically, and they decided that was too much for them, and they basically tried to fuck off and leave.
Uh,
So in that case, it worked out for us. But like, we knew we had a clear advantage. We knew that most of them were in the other wormhole, etc., right? And we were kind of prepared in a way, right? We were very much expecting them to arrive. Most groups won't be expecting you right away. They won't be as prepared, right? They'll be more disorganized like day one, if that makes sense.
So what you would say is that usually, if it's like a serious eviction, the sheer number of people that are on grid to infiltrate is going to be enough that people won't undock, even though technically the hostile force or the invading force is at the weakest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, keep in mind as well, like they won't know what comp you have and stuff, right? So like they won't have really thought like, hey, how do I actually fight this fight? They haven't really planned. And like the main reason you fight as a defender during an eviction, right, is to get your own friends in. And right away their friends won't be on standby either. Does that make sense? Right. So usually they'll like set up a time like, hey, okay, guys, tomorrow at 2000 Eve time, all our allies will be like ready in Jita, like in their fleets and whatever, right? And then we'll all log in and like try and go for it and get our friends in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Okay. So yeah, and then day one, basically like after you've bashed the structure, the rest of the day you always spend basically the whole day on logistics. I'm talking about big evictions here. Right? I'm gonna preface for a second. If you're just doing a small eviction, right? And it's like you and a couple of buddies evicting like a super AFK corp. Of course, you won't need as many supplies, you won't need as many people or whatever, right? And you won't even need to do whole control 24/7 often. Like I've done evictions where I've kept the static open most of the time and whatever because it's just like some dead AFK corp, right? But this, like, we're assuming you're evicting an active PvP corp and somebody that has teeth and wants to defend themselves, right? So once you pass their structure, you'll basically spend the whole of day one rolling wormholes, getting K-space connections up, and getting supplies and your friends in, right? People will, American, like if you start in the European time zone throughout like the evening and the night, Americans slowly start logging in, they all need to get into the wormhole, et cetera, right? So day one is just logistics, logistics, logistics. And day one rarely gets a fight, right? Like I said before, even like the evening of day one, the night of day one, is very rare that anybody actually fights to contest to defend. Now, armor timer happens, right? This is day two. It's 24 hours after the eviction started, give or take. Um, this one is important, right? Form big. This is a very common time for hostiles. I misspelled that. Sorry about that. For hostiles to try and fight you. Very often they won't even fight like contest the structure timer, but while you're busy bashing the structure, they might warp to the static and try and get whole control, right? like we mentioned before, hull control is more important than defending at armor timer, right? Because if they're outnumbered, trying to all in to defend the armor timer is a bit of a gamble, because if they lose, they're done, right? And they don't have that much to gain, because you can just not fight and then reinforce the structure again a couple of hours later, and you're still there, right? And you've just delayed the eviction by 24 hours, and it's quite a risk just to delay the eviction by 24 hours, right? It's better to fight for hull control in that situation. Often So often what you want to have is rolling squads on standby, is what we call them, which is literally like a squad in your fleet with a scanner and enough rollers to close the wormhole in one pass, ready to close the new static if they manage to roll the current one, or close incoming wormholes, etc. It's good to have a bashing wing, maybe some guys alts in bashing ships, or a secondary small fleet that has enough ships to pause the timer. So if they all warp to the static and want to go for a fight there, you can warp your fleet over no problem and keep your small number of guys behind to keep the structure paused while you fight on the static. Let's talk about hull control fights now, right? It's very common. People try to fight for hull control during or after armor, right? They've had some time to get ready. They've had some time to get their bearings, to plan, to get their allies together, etc. A very commonly used tactic is what we call alarm clocking. Somebody will just tell all our guys, okay, everybody set an alarm clock for 6 a.m. or whatever, because we won't have a lot of people online at the time, right? And by alarm clocking people at a specific time, they can get a temporary numbers advantage that they can use to win a fight, and then try and get their allies in. You'll often see this happen around downtime, right? Around those low player AUTZ hours. There is not much you can do as an attacker other than having a spy in their group or one of their allies' group. You'll see with evictions is often a network of several attacking corps, several defending corps, and there's always a leak somewhere. So often you find out that that's what they're trying to do, and you do the same thing yourself. You alarm clock yourself, and you fight them at that time. Otherwise, sometimes it's also not the end of the world if they get hull control for a few hours, right? Because they won't get that many people in. This is an awful time, so you can choose to just let them, right? Don't contest them. Give them a few hours of hull control where they get a few allies in at this awful time, and as the clock keeps ticking, right? You'll get more people logging in a couple of hours after downtime than there would have been at downtime, and then at some point you'll have the critical mass to retake hull control, which often happens, right? And then at that point, you retake hull control. Maybe you get even more allies in, right? And you escalate and you escalate, and that's how these fights become so big sometimes on evictions, right? Because hull control goes back and forth between the two groups for various reasons, and both of them keep bat funning more and more and more and more until you end up with hundreds of players on each side fighting this eviction fight. When it comes to in practice, what does a hull control fight look like? Now, when you have a static and your carrier is cloaked on the other side, it doesn't matter if they have their entire fleet on your side, you still have hull control, right? Because if they try an allied, one of their allied fleets shows up, you just close the hull, right? And they're just sitting there for no reason, right? They can't even really scan the chain. It's just a waste of time. So what they'll do is they'll try and force you to close the static. They'll maybe warp their own carrier to the static or a couple of ships and jump out. Basically sacrifice rolling ships to either close it, right, with your carrier left on the other side, or to force your carrier to roll. At that point, they will try and beat you to the next static, right? They'll have a good scanner, launch sabers in their own carrier to the next static, bubble fog that wormhole. And this game could go on for several wormholes, right? I've seen cases where this is this happens 5-6 times in a row, where both groups are kind of they know the fight is about to happen, but they're both just sitting on their citadel with a small amount of players and sabers and a couple of scanners and rolling carriers are trying to wrestle hull control from each other, if that makes sense. Kind of weird sometimes. At some point, right, let's assume they manage to actually bubble your carrier on the static. Your carrier doesn't jump through, it dies or whatever, right? And that's when the static is theirs in a way. It's controlled, it's bubbled. You can't roll it at that point. And then they'll warp their entire fleet over to try and force you to fight them or leave them with the static controlled, right? And that's when the fight starts happening. Now, even during that fight, your priority isn't necessarily killing their fleet. Your priority is rolling that wormhole, right? Because the moment that they have control, assume their allies are ready and the clock is ticking, right? sometimes within 10, 15, 20 minutes, they'll have 100 people on their way to the wormhole, right? If you get unlucky and they get a good high set, that's all it takes for them to get a lot of people in, right? And that might be GG for your eviction. Um, so very often, right, you'll end up focusing on killing their dictors and stuff, right, to clear those bubbles to allow you to suicide a carrier into the wormhole, roll it, and then lock their fleet down on the wormhole with bubblers, and then kill their fleet, right? There's been some funny situations. There was one, maybe I can find the clip after the class is over, where we had a similar fight. Was over like last year over summer, during the big wormhole war we had against Cindy, where a similar thing happened. Right, they had a bunch of allies on the way. They had momentary hold control, and the middle of the fight, for some reason, like for a split second, all the bubbles were down on the wormhole, and that was enough for us to like start warping a carrier over. Right, and like mid fight, the carrier just landed on the wormhole at 0 and jumped in, and hold control was ours, which was quite fun. And then, afterwards, we managed to gain back hold control, beat their fleet, etc. But if they hadn't dropped their bubbles like that and we hadn't been able to jump on the moment to warp in a carrier, they might have gotten like 100 people into the wormhole. I don't know exactly how many they had like ready to come in, right? And it might have gone very differently. So like focus on that wormhole. That's your priority, not necessarily winning the fight, right? Um, uh, Sometimes a sign as well of like of a whole control fight that is about to happen will be that their allies will all be sitting ready in Jita, for example, right, or in their homes. Like with your scouting, you should also get an idea of like who are these people, who are their friends, who are they likely to call for help once we evict them, right? And you want to keep eyes on their homes. You want to keep eyes in Jita. I mean, like if I know that like these people are likely to call like I don't know hard knocks for defense, and suddenly there's 50 hard knocks guys in Jita all of a sudden, maybe these 50 hard knocks guys are, getting ready to come in and these people are about to undock and contest us for hull control, right? So there's often signs like these. Very often what people will do is they won't want to give away that they're about to fight for hull control, right? They'll want that because it'll take you time to form up your fleet, right? And these precious minutes that it takes you to form up their fleet is precious extra minutes that they're guaranteed to have hull control and that their allies can be getting in. So what they'll do is they'll tell their people not to log in, right? And they'll like sit there, prepare, and then out of nowhere, their further will go up by 100 number, by 100 people, and within 2 minutes, their whole fleet undocks, right? Um, Often there will be signs for that as well. There's always some guy that logs in and then quickly logs off, etc., etc., etc. So you'll see often these further numbers will be like 10 docked, and it'll go between like 10, 11, 12, back to 10, very often in the span of like half an hour, right? That's a sign that I always gets kind of like my instinct tickling, my sixth sense tickling. Like, okay, I think they're preparing for a fight, right? And I might do a quick adhere ping, like, hey guys, be on standby, prepare a bit, make sure I can farm up a fleet as fast as possible if that happens, if that makes sense. Let's say they never fight for hull control. Maybe they fought for hull control and you won. There's still another issue, right? And those are Frigholes. Frigholes are wormholes where only frigates and destroyers can come through. They're very small. They last 4 hours, with some small exceptions. Usually they last 4 hours and they'll spawn already end of life, right? Because they last so short, and they cannot be closed. You used to be able to close them, but CCP patched that quite a while ago. And these are usually quite rare, but in evictions they always spawn. Like at this point, I just assume that they spawn, right? Um, I don't think I've ever been in an eviction where they don't spawn, and they always seem to spawn right before the whole timer. It's a bit of a joke. We always say that there's like an extra chance of a Friggle spawning when there's a structure that's reinforced in the system. I don't know if that's actually true, but sometimes it feels like that's true. These are very annoying, of course, because you cannot close them, right? So you can't close the wormhole, and they can just get allies in. And often they'll get their allies in shuttles, right? Shuttles are insta warp and bubble immune, so there's almost nothing you can do to stop this stream of shuttles coming in. So it's good to if a Friggle happens to spawn in your eviction hole, then the first thing we always do is just bubble fuck it, right? That's why we bring in those anchorable bubbles. We'll just build a very big like grid of bubbles around so that if they try and get anything but shuttles in, easy kill, right? Another good thing to do, you can do sometimes a Friggle can spawn to another wormhole, right? In that case, you can use Higgs, which, with their little mass entangler thing, can go through a Friggle, right? you get those higgs into the Friggle and start rolling off the wormholes there, and you control the Friggle itself directly. No, well-prepared defenders will have their own frigate-sized comp, right? Confessors, Jackdaws, Kikis, stuff like that, and they'll try to get those into the static into the Friggle from their home and contest whole control on the other side. So if you're doing a very big, very well-prepared eviction, it's good to have that on standby as well, ready to hand out some Jackdaws, some Fessers, some Kikis. I think I like Jackdaws the most for this kind of job, right? The range advantage, you can really just start picking off Confessors, even with like 20, 30 Jackdaws if FC'd properly. Um, and that's happened before, right? Where you have like 200 guys on it's like in the actual like Wormhole where eviction is happening, just kind of like waiting around while like 10 or 20 guys are fighting for their life inside that Friggle, and nobody can really like help them if that makes sense, right? Um, but yeah, that's the main thing. Friggles are very annoying. Friggles are also, I think, one of the reasons why people always blob quite hard during evictions, right? Because no matter how well you play it, it's kind of pure RNG. If a Friggle spawns, they can get 200 guys in, right? And it's over if you don't have those 200 guys yourself, which can be very annoying. But it can also lead to good fights, right? Sometimes it's the only way defenders can bring in people, and suddenly they have numbers that they needed to try and defend the wormhole. Uh, and suddenly you have a very good fight on your hand. Now, the whole timer, we call it the pinata sometimes, right? Um, Fights are very common during whole timer, and people always choose to fight on the whole timer, right? Like they're kind of like, oh, we've lost everything already. Anyways, if we don't fight, we might as well like provide the last stand. I don't think it's a good timer to fight on personally. I wouldn't fight on a whole timer, but people choose to fight on that timer more often than not. So often you'll get like a nice little fight, and then afterwards, if you're successful in the fight, you get to kill the structure. One big thing there, and the grid gets very messy there, right? You can see on the picture. I mean, there is a lot of ships there, a lot of people. People get very excited at all the loot dropping. They'll start warping around, looting cans, blah blah blah. It's very important that you maintain discipline and have a system that's already pre-planned for how you're going to actually loot that grid, right? Um, it's often overlooked, right? Because I mean, the most important part is winning, but looting is quite important, and getting that done properly is quite important. I always tell people like, if they drop my fleet, I kill them, right? Because as long as they're in my fleet, I get loot logs, so I can see if somebody tries to like sneak away with some loot. There's always some greedy guy. If they drop your fleet, they can steal stuff without you noticing. So I never allow people to leave my fleet, right? What I'll have my interdictors or like my small ships warp around and use the tagging system that people also use like in incursions and stuff, right? To tag the cans according to their value. And that way your hauling ships can quickly see like because they're slow warping, so it's annoying for them to like warp between can and can, finding a valuable one. Find a can that's worth a lot of money and scoop that loot. Meanwhile, you should decide like, hey, like what kind of like ISK to M3 ratio am I actually going to bother hauling out, right? So a lot of like stuff like titanium and stuff, you'll find like a billion titanium in a can. That's not really worth hauling out. There's more effort to haul that out than it is to, than it is worth selling, if that makes sense. Same for like cheap frigates and T1 ships and stuff, right? So we'll usually like drop the ships from the cans and kill them, better killbirds a little bit, and haul out all the actual valuables, which anyways are like the majority of the ISK value of the loot of an eviction, if that makes sense. So just be prepared, have a system, and post eviction is going to be several days of hauling all your supplies back out, all your loot back out. It's a pain in the ass, but it feels good, right? Because that's where you're actually making money. Yeah. And when it comes to the larger PvP evictions, they're rarely actually profitable. People brag a lot about, oh, this and that person's home dropped this many billion ISK. But between all the money you spent on the assets you got in, all the time you invested in the eviction and stuff, those big evictions, I mean, sometimes you come out ISK positive, but like the ISK hour calculated is god awful, right? So if you're doing a big eviction, you either do it because you really dislike the guy or because you want the fight. And the fight is worth it. The fights are very, very good during evictions because you got to imagine, right? Like you'll have spent months planning, countless hours planning, right? And that's on the line for you. I mean, their entire home is on the line. So these fights have a lot on the line, which makes them all the more exciting, right? And everybody really gives it their everything. And yeah, so they're great fights often. Okay, so now that we've gone through, I guess, the basics of how to perform an eviction on the attacking side, we're gonna go on some tips on actually defending from an eviction, right? So if you want to be boring about it, freighters are the best home defense doctrine in Eve, because you can just put all your assets in a freighter. Freighter alts are only a couple of injectors, I think 2.5 or 3, so they're relatively cheap, right? If you're a wormholer and you have access to that thermal income, it shouldn't be a massive expense for you. And you can just put all your assets in that freighter, lug it off, self-destruct your main back to Jita, and that's that, right? And what I suggest you do, instead of trying to contest the eviction, you safe log all your assets and you self-destruct Jita and you just go straight to their home and hit that while they're all in your home trying to evict you, right? And you do like a base trade. And if they don't have that freighter home defense type shit, right, they won't be ready for it, and you'll make, you'll get all their assets and they'll get none of yours. Part of that is also flipping your structures often, which means unanchoring them on a set schedule once every 6 months, maybe once every year, to get all that stuff from your AFK members, right? If you're nice about it, you contract it back to those AFK members, right? You don't steal their assets, but some people do steal the assets in the end. That is what it is. But that means that at any given point, your structure is also not worth that much, right? So it's not as much of a juicy target for anyone. So those are two fairly important parts when it comes to defense. If you actually choose to fight for your defense, right, which can lead to very fun fights, which is definitely worth it sometimes, one important thing is to have handouts for your allies. That way, shuttles are, some of the fastest ships in Eve when it comes to getting from place to place, and a fighting fleet is not. Shuttles are, bubble immune and insta-warp, etc. So like shuttles are very easy, relatively a lot easier to get in than combat ships are. So at any opportunity that you get hull control for a short amount of time, it's going to be relatively easy to get a lot of shuttles in. And if you have like a ships to hand them out, you can get them in shuttles, hand them out the ships, and you have a combat fleet ready to go like that. T1 battleships are very cost effective and punch above their weight, right? Like I said before, so like a T1 battleship comp works. If you have enough of them, you can fight a lot with a bunch of T1 battleships in a wormhole. Caps are very oppressive as well. Carriers and nullsec, I'm pretty sure they're not that good, but in wormhole space, carriers are very good when it comes to home defense. You just undock them and sit them on the undock of your own structure, and those fighters can just zoom around grid and really like chew up all those big battleship fleets that are trying to evict you. Like I said before, right, in pulsars, they're even more oppressive. Um, so yeah, carriers are good. If you have a small group of people, right, like it's just you and a couple of buddies, or like a small corp. I mean, hull dreads are fairly strong, right? They dish out a lot of damage. The main mistake that I see people make that try to defend with dreads is their dreads are like super shit fit. A shit fit dread is worthless, right? It'll die very quickly. A proper fit dread, however, is quite strong. Another big mistake that I see people make in larger evictions is they'll try and field actively tanked dreads. It's usually in wormhole space, that's the meta, right? Because you have a small amount of caps, so you active tank dread. But once you're talking like 20 or 30 versus 30 dread fights, if one group is buffer fit and the other group's active fit, the buffer fit dreads will win every single time. And I've won a lot of cap brawls like that, right? Where we were outnumbered, but we had buffer dreads and they had active fit dreads. And so we killed all their caps and they barely killed any of ours, right? So those are two very important things. But yeah, a proper fit hull dread, if you got like 2 or 3 of those, I mean, that's a lot of damage you have on grid, right? And that's a lot of damage you can do to their fleet. So those can be quite strong. And the other things, of course, I mean, uh, don't make yourself a target in a way. If you're an asshole to a lot of people, that means more people are going to be inclined to come and evict you. If you're nice, less people are going to be inclined. And flip your structures, right? Because people will know that that structure has been up for 2 years and you're a fairly active corp, and that means that structure is worth a shit ton of money, and that makes you a big target. But at the end of the day, right, like even if Uni got evicted, right, even though they're seen as like a nice group that people shouldn't want to evict, um, shit just happens sometimes, right? And there's not much you can do to like fully defend yourself from evictions. They are going to happen. There's always a bigger fish, right? Like Hard Knocks, we were for the longest time, like the biggest, strongest, scariest group in wormhole space. We thought we were unevictable. We had our nice keep stars, etc. and then suddenly the whole of the Imperium is in our home with thousands of players, and there's nothing we can do to defend. So there's nothing you can really do to fully prepare and to fully be safe. Somebody could always show up, if that makes sense. Okay, so that was the presentation, I guess, the class itself. We went, I guess, through the basics. I mean, evictions are incredibly complicated subject, right? So I wanted to just go over the basics, if that makes sense. And at this point, we have time, as much time as we need really for a Q&A. So I'll just leave it over to the questions and start answering those as they come.
So we already have quite a few questions on the classroom chat here on Discord, but I'll maybe just read out the one on Twitch, because that's the one might not be on your screen at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So that one was saying, in some of your more recent evictions, was it the former, you really didn't like the folks, or the latter, you wanted a good fight? What was your motivation?
It's often a combination of both, I think. For me, at least, I mean, I've done a lot of evictions that are just small, kind of like, oh, we need a bit of money, right, for corps. We're gonna evict some smaller group. Or like, oh, those guys are like assholes. But like, they're a small group. We're big, so it's low effort, right? When it comes to actual big evictions, it's always a combination of both. I mean, not liking the people makes for a nice story, makes for like a nice casus belli in a way, right? It also gets your people like excited to log in. It gives you higher numbers, right? But also, I mean, I love the fight, right? So for me, a successful eviction is one that we win, but also one where there's a good fight. So I'll always be looking for targets that are likely to fight back, that are likely to provide that good fight that I'm looking for, if that makes sense.
Perfect, thanks. Would you like me to read out the classroom questions? I'm not sure if you're able to see your Discord chat.
I am able to look at them, no worries. So I can
Perfect.
just go through them right. Okay, give me a second to go through them here. Okay. So what statics make it easier to evict a wormhole and why, and vice versa? I think the easier to evict ones are class 5s, I think, are the easiest to evict, in my opinion, with a high class static. Reason being that a high class static, right, a capital static is easier to control because you just need the one carrier as opposed to 4 or 6 like rolling battleships for a low class static. And there's just one static to control, right? So those are the easiest ones, I think. Class 5s with like C5, C5, I guess. Um, the hardest ones to evict are wormholes with a case-based static. Something like a nullsec static, C2, C5 nullsec are like awful to evict. Also because often they'll have fairly skilled PvP corps living inside, right? So that adds to the challenge. It's 2 statics to control. It's a lot easier to get people in through that nullsec, right? They can stage from Thera or Turner or whatever. So like anytime they get whole control, they already have that case-based. They're never more than 20 jumps away, right? They can even like sign on top of the hole with a blobs or whatever. So like it's a massive pain. Um, so yeah, those are my 2 least favorite. And one preface is that C6s are a lot harder to evict against people with a lot of friends because there's only about 100 C6s in the game, like 120 something, which means that they'll all just bunch up in like a wormhole with a C6 static and rage roll, and they're almost guaranteed to connect several times throughout the eviction, right? So it's going to be easy for them to get people in. So that's like an important preface. C6s are quite hard to evict. Okay, carriers are quite good on the last slide. What are they good for? Yeah, carriers are good for fighters, right? Like they're good for killing battleships, basically. Uh, I went through this earlier, right? But like, yeah, like 30 carriers with a big ball of fighters, it will just really, really chew up a battleship fleet. What was the reason to evict the whole control dudes? They wanted to get evicted, and we wanted to evict them. So when we had a large war where they were part of the enemy side around 6 months ago, and we were when like I guess peace talks happened, we kind of offered all the enemy groups this deal that said basically most of the groups basically were like, okay, right, like you can keep whatever you have left at this point, and we just make this deal where we will not like we have like a non-aggression pact for 6 months where we will not hit each other's homes or each other's farms or whatever during those 6 months at all. And then afterwards we'll just go back to kind of like pre-war status, right? and they specifically said, we agreed to all of those terms, but the Keepstar wormhole is not part of the deal, right? Kind of like signaling like, hey, we want you to come and attack it. And they said so much themselves afterwards as well, right? Like, we put the Keepstar down because we wanted someone to come attack it. So we could maybe get a fight. So there was no bad blood there at all, right? For us, nice Keepstar. They want to fight. We want to fight. Let's go. Kind of deal. How's the Holy Eviction going? I have no idea, man. I've been very FK, so yeah. Why is T1 standard energy ammo not a good option? Less damage than T2 or faction, right? Basically, for ammo's fairly check faction, ammo's fairly cheap, so like you should always just use faction or T2 ammo, really. Why is the post so important? You want somewhere you can dock, right? Like anchoring a citadel takes 24 hours. Anchoring a post takes like 15 minutes plus half an hour onlining, whatever. Like short, right? Like less than an hour. So while you're waiting for your big structure to anchor, you want a post to literally live out of for the first 24 hours of the eviction, right? If you need to swap ships between like your combat ship and a scanner or a roller or log off somewhere safe, it's very hard to do that from space. We've done it before, but it's a massive pain. What will replace them? No idea. We have a fairly competent Wormhole CSM this turn, so we hope that he's able to kind of like figure something out with CCP. But if bosses ever go away, we will really need some kind of like weak but quickly anchoring structure, because otherwise evictions are going to be a lot harder to do. And when you roll holes as an evictor, do you take the extra steps to keep your rollers inside? Absolutely, yes. In case of emergency, you can always like get them rolled out. But I mean, it takes a lot of time to get those rollers back in. If it's a carrier, it's not impossible to get it back in any like decent amount of time, right? So yeah, you do take the extra steps. I mean, rollers are like ammo in a way, right? But like they're a limited resource. You're not gonna have like 100 of them laying around. The pilot that you roll out is also a pilot that's not gonna come back anytime soon, right? So like you gotta be careful with your resources. There must be a lot of math involved in figuring out exactly how much it takes to roll a wormhole. Not really. There's no third-party source, but there are. Let me see if I can find that. Actually, I should have it saved somewhere. I mean, at this point, I know like from experience, but each kind of wormhole, there's only like 3 or 4 like, different classes of mass, if that makes sense, right? And they all have a set sequence of rollers, like of jumps in and out that you do to roll it with basically 100% success rate, if that makes sense. And there's little charts, right? Like little graphs that show you exactly like what those steps are. So it's fairly easy to know. And like most veteran wormholers will know that stuff by heart, if that makes sense. And yeah, C5s are just 2 shots, right? Like, so when we say hot, we mean with your prop mod on, because it adds mass to your ship. With like a C5 static from a C5, you jump your carrier in with your prop mod on, you jump it back home with your prop mod on, and the hull will be gone, right? Yeah, it's that easy. And the capital will not have an X anchor, but battleships will have X anchors. A confused log of freighter, how to self-destruct, what to home. Yeah, it's a one preface, right? On the whole, like everything drops from a wormhole. W- if you are logged off while sitting in a ship, that ship will not drop, right? You'll stay logged off in that ship. So if you log off in a freighter, that freighter will, just be logged off in space the next time you log it in. And we call it a suitcase, exactly. So you don't self-destruct the freighter now. You have the freighter on a different character than your main is the idea, right? That would be the ideal. So you put the freighter in a different character than your main. You trade that character all your assets. You put all those assets in the freighter. You log off that character with all your assets inside the freighter, and then you self-destruct your main, or don't, right? But at least your assets will be safe, whatever you do with your main. All right. What role does insider intel play in evictions? A lot, right? I mean, having a spy in their group is huge when it comes to evictions. I mean, you'll know what home defense comp they have. You'll have a much better idea, like how prepared they are, etc. How do you go procuring it? I mean, you make an alt, you train it up, and you apply it to their corp, right? Like that's basically what you do. Or like one of their allies that maybe have lower requirements, stuff like that. So yeah, constantly. So sorry, the question from Twitch in regards to the carriers being oppressive in a pulsar. Is it a combination of constantly being able to take reps plus a sig bonus for drone application? Basically, yeah. It's mainly the sig bonus there, right? Their carriers will be like within, like just on the unlock of the structure, so it's quite hard to damage them. You can't really drop your dreads on their carriers, on their structure, because they'll take damage from the structure. That's quite oppressive, right? The structure will chew through your dreads. So the carriers are relatively fairly safe, whilst their drones can project the whole grid, right? Like 1,000 kilometers away from the carrier is no problem. And yeah, with that sig bonus, they'll apply really, really well. In my own personal assessment, what kind of doctrine would you recommend for us to adopt, defend, or wormhole, if any? Remind me, what effect is your wormhole, a vanilla, or what effect does it have?
Vanilla.
Vanilla, and what class?
C4.
I mean, I think T1 battleships, right? Even Praxis is some shit, right? Like, I mean, all that stuff, it hits hard. Of course, you have like the problem of lowest speed, right? It depends. So to me, I think, let's put it like this, right? I think the choice often is like, do you want to brawl or do you want to be long range? I think the cutoff is like between 50 and 60 pilots. If you expect to have below that number, you might as well get a brawling comp. Something fairly cheap that comes to mind would be like rapid heavy praxises, for example, right? Like they're not ideal, they're not like super meta or whatever. 50 of them will still like really fucking hurt. Does that make sense, right? And you'll almost always go as positive, right? Against like a Lashak blob or whatever. And then of course, if they have like 100 people, your 50 praxises won't do much, right? Like that's kind of the way it is. Otherwise, I mean, if you want to go long range, like, RT maelstroms or whatever like the nullsec kids use as a flavor of the month, like any battleship, any decent battleship will do, I think. If you really want to be cheap about it, I mean, like even Feroxes are good, right? Or like, I don't know if they've nerfed CFIs recently, but like CFIs are fucking cracked for their price range, right? So like, there's quite a few options. Just look for like whatever cheaper but effective long range comp like the nullsecers use, because they spend all their time theory crafting that stuff, right? So they have a pretty good idea. Mm.
There's
So
a
how?
I'm sorry,
Sorry.
there's a second part of the question too.
Okay. Yeah, my threat assessment. I mean, right, like you guys got evicted before because of the loot pinata that they were expecting, right? Like that was a group that just purely evicts, or mainly evicts for the loot money, right? Uh, and they knew that your structures were very old. They know that you guys have a lot of players coming in, going AFK, right? So like a very high turnover of players, if that makes sense, which leads to like an accumulation of a lot of assets over time. Um, So they kind of expected there to be just a lot of loot there from a group that's relatively small and not that well defended, right? So I think the first thing you do, like start flipping your structure every 6 months and make yourself less of a target, right? And that will really help. Yeah, that will really help, like lowering the risk there, and then having at least like leadership have freighters for like the main corp assets is big, right? And then like a T1 defense comp, I think, right? Like what I mentioned before. I don't think there's a large threat right now, but I mean, there could always be some guy coming in tomorrow. Like you never know, right? Like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the threat chance is. I mean, it can always happen, so you should always be prepared, if that makes sense. Have I ever seen a Starburst defense as in Rooks and Kings? I have never seen a Starburst defense like Rooks and Kings. No, I mean, because people don't really use bosses anymore, right? Like, I mean, people use them like I think the main use bosses get these days is evictions and those first 24 hours of an eviction, right? I saw a Starburst a couple of months ago. We were doing an eviction, and if you know how bosses work, they'll have a password, and you need to like put that password in like this text field, and the button to change your ship's name and the window to change your ship's name are fairly similar to the one to put in the POS password. So it'll happen that people rename their ship to the POS password, and the enemies figured out the POS password that way, right? Without us realizing. So they got into the POS and started wreaking havoc, and we had to change the password. And we had like 200 chips just sitting there in the POS unpiloted, and those all starbursted out, which was very unpleasant for us and very fun for our enemies. But we ended up winning the eviction in the end, so all was good. Yeah. I mean, like if you look at the pure like meta perspective, yes. Like if sorry, the question is if I'm suggesting that not taking the fight to defend the hole and just suitcasing is the best defense, yeah. It'll discourage future evictors, right? Because there's no fight to be had. There's no loot to be had. So why would they evict you? And it allows you freedom, right? You're not just like stuck in this crowned wormhole with like 300 enemies anymore, right? Like desperately trying to get people in. Like what I would do if I get evicted, right? I'm gonna be in their home an hour after they go into my home. Does that make sense, right? Like it's not just that part. It's not just like logging off. It's going on the offensive, right? Like take the initiative back, if that makes sense. Um, yeah, and I think that's the best defense. I mean, it's happened to us before, right? Like we evicted someone, they showed up into our home, but we had all our assets like, in freighters, so we just logged off all of our assets, but we kept evicting them. We won the eviction of their home and 800 billion ISK drop, and they evicted our home, but like whatever drop, like 20 bill drop, right? So like nothing. So we still win. Does that make sense? So yeah, I mean, logging off and suitcasing is powerful, it's a good deterrent, but also attack, right? That being said, there's also the argument for like, I don't care about the optimal, I care about having fun. I mean, yeah, then you just defend your wormhole, right? Because it can lead to a lot of fun fights. But like purely from like, I want to win, I want like the most metagamey strategy, I think that's the best one. Is it better to commit more to structure defense, timers, or trying to wrestle whole control? Say yeah for the defensive side. No, wrestle whole control, man. I mean, it depends. You will only want to wrestle whole control if you have allies on standby to come in, of course. You don't need to wrestle for whole control if you have enough numbers to fight them and win as well. But in 9 out of 10 cases, they'll have more than you, and you'll have a bunch of allies waiting to get in. So fight for whole control, fuck the timers, if that makes sense. In my opinion, right? It's like fighting the timers, you're fighting uphill, and even if you win, they'll just reinforce the structures, right? Like fighting for whole control, you get your allies in, you might actually win the whole eviction because suddenly you have more people than them, right? Once you get all your people in, that's when you start fighting for the timers or the structures. So in the event of an eviction, you just wait an arbitrary number of time and just exit wormhole your freighters back. Yeah, exactly. That's basically what you do. Or you just re-anchor structures and keep living in the wormhole, right? What we did was we just waited a week. All the enemies left, and we just re-anchored the freighters or logged in our freighters, and we were back in our home with all of our assets still there, right?
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That makes so much sense.
Right, yeah. So that's what makes it so powerful, right? Like you lose the structure, sure, that sucks, right? But it's like less than what it could have been, right? How you deal about counterattacking against groups like UDS that don't have a home to target? Yeah, right. Like that's a tough situation. And you're also like fighting uphill there because they're affiliated with groups like Hard Knocks and Laserhawks, right? And I mean, you're not gonna be able to fight like Hard Knocks and Laserhawks in Hard Knocks or Laserhawks home, of course, right? So like that's one of those cases where like there's always a bigger fish, right? Like when we got like evicted by Imperium, it's not like we can like go evict Delve, right? Well, they're in our home or whatever, right? Like sometimes that's just the way Eve is. There's always a bigger blob, and you're just fucked, right? But if you have the freighters, you minimize the asset loss in that case, right? And that's also the reason why like doesn't matter how well you prepare your eviction defense. If 2,000 guys show up, there is nothing you can do, right? Does that make sense? Whereas with the freighters, it really doesn't matter how many people they have, right? So yeah, like what are my best tips for an eviction defense? I mean the freighter one. But if you want to fight, I think I think what I would do if I had like enough people to go for it and friends like waiting is probably do a play for whole control during the armor timers, right? I think that's a solid strategy. They'll be like stuck between trying to contest the timer and contest whole control, right? They'll have a lot of people logged in, but hopefully so should you because your timer should be in your prime time in many cases. Um, So that is a potentially good play, right? Otherwise, a lot of people do, especially if you live like in a c5, is you just have your allies rage roll all day and try to get in that way, and then you fight like armor or whole timer for the numbers. But I think fighting for whole control is better. Do it like either during whole timer or sorry during the timer, or do it in a time zone where you will have a better numbers advantage, right? If you know that they're weak in AUTZ, but you have a lot of people in AUTZ, then fight then, right? Like try and find any kind of advantage you can, and then go for the fight and get your friends in. I'm just waiting for more questions to show up.
Yeah, that's quite a few people typing.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, there's furious tippity tapping on keyboards.
Yeah, so say we want to fight, since we live in a vanilla C4, is there critical mass of capitals and types of capitals that could make it very difficult to evict us? No, I mean capitals are super strong in low class, right? Because um, if I'm attacking a C5 Wormhole, I can get my own capitals in, right? We've done it before. We've even pre-seeded capitals. Like when we evicted TD Sin, in the months going up to the eviction, we seeded 30 carriers in their Wormhole, right? So they didn't have that big of a capital advantage anymore. In a C4 vanilla, the enemies will never have caps in your home unless they somehow have a spy steal them or whatever, but that's very rare, right? Um, so when it comes to capitals, it depends on the numbers. I think if you can field like 30 or 40, then carriers are your best bet, right? Like 30 or 40 carriers in a C4 is very, very hard to evict, right? That's a death ball, right? If you're like, is this gonna be 5? Just go with Hall Dreads, man. Like, there's no need for Capcom Dreads because there's no capitals to fight. And like, if you have that many dreads, there's no reason to try and do any kind of like Vindicator, webbing, capital guns, applying shenanigans, right? Just keep it simple, right? Like, I think Hall PNIs are probably the best because they're so tanky and they do a shit ton of damage. Although they could get fireballed potentially, right? But like, Hard Reds are powerful. Like the Morris Navy is quite good as well, right? The Rev Navy is quite good. You want to prioritize tank over DPS, right? Because you can always like bring more dreads for more DPS, but you can just bring more dreads for more tank if that makes sense, right? Um, and I think I would go active. In most cases, I would go active, but I would have, if you have the ISK, like a cheap buffer fit available, right? Like if they bring 200 people, then yeah. What about fax? Faxes are also strong, man. The problem with faxes in the current meta is that since inject faxes don't exist, uh, you're forced to rely on regen faxes, and regen faxes because of the way like modules scale when they get more expensive, like officer and shit, and they stack. They only become good if you invest a lot of money in them, right? So like a 30 billion ISK regen fax is pretty fucking scary. Well, like a cheap regen fax is not that useful. However, what makes faxes good is that if you have a few of them, they become kind of like they have to kill the faxes before they can kill anything else, right? So if you just break tank them and you have a bunch of them, then they can be quite good. If you've got like 3 or 4 faxes, right? Break tanked, then your fleet is not really gonna die. And they're gonna struggle to chew through those faxes, especially if they go with like a long range kind of comp. But if they go short range comp and you have like 5 dreads, 3 or 4 faxes, uh, they have to commit to kill the dreads, right? Or to kill the faxes. And if they commit to kill the faxes, they're on their dread gun. They're under your fleet's guns. Well, you get repped pretty well by your faxes, right? So like that's quite powerful, I think. What are the best ways to get reinforcements into defend? I mean, like I said, right? Like fight for whole control, get whole control. I think ideally you have handouts and you stage them in like either Turner or Thera. That way, like when you get whole control, you might only have it for like half an hour, maybe an hour if you're lucky, right? So you need them to be able to burn to any like case base you find. Sometimes you get unlucky and like the best you have is a 30 Jita, like Amar, Wormhole, whatever the fuck, right? So if you stage them in Jita, that's gonna be very far. If they're in Turner or Thera, that maximizes the chance that they find a close connection to whatever case base you find in the limited amount of time you have. How do you do Logi? No, you still do logi, right? Because at long range doesn't like. So when it comes to like blob comms, your logi to DPS ratio will not be as like intense as for like those smaller brawling fleet. You still want logi, right? Like I still want like 40. Like if I say I have a full fleet, like 250 guys, right? I'll still want 30 or 40 logi. There's also like the structure you need to tank, right? Like the structure will deal damage. But one like alpha your ships, but it'll still do damage. And often like at long ranges or as the fight goes on, right? Like if you don't have logi, and you're kind of trading evenly with them, sure, at the beginning everybody gets alpha out of grid, but like as the fight goes on, people stop getting alpha out of grid, right? And then the logi plays a much more important role. There's been a lot of fights where like, the first 10 minutes, right? Like I'm losing ships left and right, was getting volleyed, but like as I'm volleying them as well, some point I just stop losing ships, right? And then you really start winning hard. Um, let's see. Scorched Earth, no, but when is it a good time to move? I've never lived Nomad to be honest. But I mean, if you're if you're chilling in like a good wormhole and there's like nobody camping you and you're making good money, then don't move, And if like if it gets hot, then move, right? If that makes sense. So like people start noticing you live there and they start camping, and you should probably start moving. Buffer or active hull dreads, it depends on how many, right? I think buffer if you have like 15 or more. Buffer if you're fighting like 200, people. Active if you're fighting fewer people, if that makes sense. Having several holes is good, yes and no, right? I mean, my corp owns, what is it, 30, 40 wormholes or something. Um, however, all of our PvP players live in one wormhole because like it sucks if like sure, there might be more content and more wormholes, but like if there's only 5 people living in one wormhole, five in the other, five in the other, five in the other, right? Then one guy finds content, but he doesn't have the numbers, nobody else can help him, etc. Right? So you generally want like all your PvP players in one wormhole, and then the other wormholes are just for alts to farm to make money to support your PvP. Are bombing runs useful? I think they are. I mean, the thing with bombing runs is they're very hard to pull off, and they become a bit of a crux, right? And wormholers generally are not that experienced with bombing runs. I see a lot of people try. I never see them having like great impact. There's also a bit of a gamble. Like in case space, you do a bombing run, your bomber dies, you just respawn, right? Grab a new bomber and sign back into the fight, whatever, right? In Wormhole space, you make one mistake, bomber's dead, Vital is spotted out, and he's out of the eviction for good. But if you have an extremely skilled guy with bomber alts, void bombs can be very good at shutting down like range fleets sometimes. Oh, any other questions? Also, like, feel free to speak up on voice, of course.
While we're waiting to see if anyone else is going to ask a question, I'm just going to link the class feedback link for anyone who's about to leave or for later. Please give us feedback, let us know how we can improve and so on, just while we're waiting for any other questions.
And meanwhile, I'd just like to say thanks for sharing this stuff with us. We don't necessarily have a lot of experience with this type of content, so it's kind of nice having somebody with outside perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry for swearing, man. I'm very bad with that. But yeah, no, I'm always glad to give classes and finding it quite fun. I'll try to plan in some more like after the new year on various wormhole things. It's the problem with Eve, right? Is like it's a very deep and complicated game, and there's not really like any good tutorials around there, right? Like if you want to do an eviction, it's hard to figure that stuff out if you don't have like anyone to tell you how to do it, right? Uh, so yeah, I think it's good to go out there and teach like the newer, less experienced players like the ropes, especially because Wormhole Space is super reliant on an influx of newer players to stay alive, right? So like you guys playing in Wormhole Space means more people for me to fight in the future, if that makes sense. Like from a selfish perspective. When is it a good time to remove roles? Someone's drunk, upset, suspect. Depends on your corp, man. I mean, if you think somebody doesn't fit in with your group and he's an active like detriment, then kick them out of the group, right? I mean, in the end, it's your group to run, and it's your job to turn it into like a nice group where people are friends and like each other and stuff. What are the most popular successful eviction comps? It's changed a lot over time, man. I've had a lot of success with TFIs. I've evicted decent with TFIs. Macarials were for the longest time like the standard go-to eviction comp, right? Every single Wormhole group would use Macarials for both their home defense and their offense. But I think TFIs are quite good, like as an all-rounder, if you have like very large numbers. But in general, like most evictions are smaller and they just get done with like brawl comp, right? Most evictions end up doing using like Lashaks or uh, Nighthawks, right? All that stuff, right? Like whatever brawl comp they have available. Is the Mac no longer meta? Not really. It's still good. Don't get me wrong. It's just not optimal, right? I think there's better chips at that price point. There's better chips that are cheaper. So it's not, it's not S tier. It's just like A or B tier or whatever, right? If that makes sense. But like there's no reason to bring it if it's not the best, right? So evictions are very intense, right? That's actually a good question. Evictions tend to burn out people as well. I mean, it requires a lot from people, right? It's 3 days where you're constantly in that wormhole. You need constant hold control. You need people like, door stopping at static constantly and stuff. So like in Hard Knocks, we try and keep the big evictions at a small schedule, right? As in try and do like a very big one once a year, maybe twice a year. Of course, didn't need arises for us to evict people as like for other reasons other than like we want to really evict these guys, right? So like plan like a big one, like a big group we want to evict, like once a year maybe. And then throughout the year, there's a lot of smaller evictions going on. Well, often they're like maybe a guy, like a couple of guys doing a personal eviction to get a new farm home, stuff like that. But keep it on the low, right? How I see the role of Diplo in terms of eviction, both offensive and defense. I mean, important, of course. I mean, the thing with Diplo is like, I don't believe in like a corp Diplo, if that makes sense, right? I mean, in a way that like the way Hard Knocks has always done diplomacy is just like I'm mates with that director and that corp or whatever, right? And I talk to the guy, and of course, if I've got a and like another director might be friends with another guy in another group, he talks to the guy. It's a lot more organic, if that makes sense, right? Like we're just all one big group of people, and like whoever is friends with whoever talks to whoever. However, of course, there's a need to like do more kind of out of the blue diplo. I personally hate doing diplo with like random strangers, right? I have some like other director take care of that. But mm, more generally speaking, it's very important as a group to have friends, right? You need friends you can rely on to defend your hole. You need friends you can rely on to attack someone with you if the need arises or if you want to. It's good to have like a big connection of people. It's good to go out there and just hang out with people, do joint ops or whatever, right? Uh, and Wormhole Space is a fairly small community, it's a fairly tight community, right? And the more people you know, in a way, the less likely you are to get evicted as well, right? People all know you. It's like, why would I evict this guy? I like him, kind of deal, right? But if you're like a random stranger, then you're just an opportunity. Does that make sense? I'm gonna link a few videos, I think. Was Waffles fun to evict? Yes. Waffles was fun. So for context, Waffles was the staging. So like before summer, there was like a big war on wormholes, and Waffles was the staging system of the enemy coalition. And I kind of made the call to go and evict it at one point. We were like we were kind of losing the war for at the beginning, right? They caught us by surprise with a very large coalition. Hard Knocks reformed at that point for the war. And as soon as we kind of felt like we started getting the upper hand, I was very adamant that we should just go hit waffles right away, because I knew there was going to be a lot of shit fit caps in there, mainly because I saw them moving in caps from their farm holes, but I didn't see a lot of, or we didn't see a lot of like logistics happening, right? So just kind of like had a gut feeling that all our caps would be like farm fit, shit fit. So we went in and we rage rolled the whole day to get like a bunch of PNIs. I got a nice cap roll and we won, and that was good fun. J space is comparatively small and has relatively few people. How you keep a balance between evicting who you can and not remaining alone in that space? Yeah, I mean that's important, right? That's why, like in Wormhole space, there is like a code of honor, right? That says you shouldn't be evicting other PvP corps, because a PvP corp is content, and by evicting them, you like actively remove that content, right? Of course, like I've evicted plenty of PvP corps before, right? Like people still do it, of course. But it is a consideration. I'm also a bit of the mindset that like if your group dies because of an eviction, then in a way you were never going to last in the first place, right? Like sometimes an eviction brings a group together, right? Like reinforces that bond, gives them an enemy to hate and a reason to play, right? In a very like I guess survival of the fittest type mindset that you can have on the subject. But you'll see that a lot of bigger groups, they do care about the health of Wormhole space, right? And they will take that into consideration, and they won't just go around bullying anyone. Well, they'll still, do bad things, don't get me wrong, right? It's definitely something we think about, if that makes sense. Anyways, going to look for some videos. Give me a second. Just gonna stop streaming real quick.
Perfect. So while Victor is looking for the links for the videos, so I'll share them in the stream as well. I think we've been going now for a good hour and a half. So I'll probably just wait for all the links to be done, and then I'll thank everyone for coming. Thank you very much for all of your questions, and thank you very much to Viktor Pvolman, who came to speak to us and spent this time and shared his knowledge with us. Hopefully we'll hear from him again. In the meantime, I'm just going to link a few links. Please fill the feedback form for us if you can. That would be greatly appreciated.
So yeah, videos from the final timer. This question, I just started playing League again because some friends got into it like 2 weeks ago. I don't know. Don't ask me about League of Legends. I don't know. I don't even know why I'm playing that game. But videos from the final timer of the eviction of TD Sin in 2020-ish, which was at the time one of the biggest evictions in Wormhole space, right? And one of my favorite fights I've ever like been a part of or have seen in Wormhole space. And that's kind of like, that's for me, like fights like that are why I do evictions, if that makes sense, right? Like the amount of adrenaline and dopamine really hits you when you do those fights is that's what we play Eve, if that makes sense, right? Like that's something you don't find in any other video game around there, as far as I'm aware. It's insane. I remember like I was seeing until maybe 4 a.m, and I was like literally shaking afterwards, and I couldn't sleep until 10 a.m. because I was just so wired up from that whole happening, right? I think that's kind of like that's what he was about for me, and that's why I love evictions. If that makes sense, like it's the only place where you get fights like that, with so much at stake, right? So I just wanted to share that video real quick about that particular fight. Why I think evictions are fun once in a while.
Just from the screenshots, it's already looking quite impressive. So just to say, we're gonna stop the Twitch stream now. But if people want to hang out and have another couple of questions here on Discord, feel free.